Hello everyone, this is me, I'm just Shafiq, and today I will be talking about the internal circuits of cerebellum. In the last video, we had talked about the introduction to cerebellum in association with the neuroscience, and now we will be discussing the external fibers moving into the cerebellum and giving the input sensory information and how that sensory information is converted into the output response to the periphery parts of the bodies. So let us discuss it now. But before studying it, let me tell you that all the external fibers that are moving into the cerebellum can be classified into two categories: the climbing fibers and the mosey fibers. So listen again, that all the external fibers that move into the cerebellum can be classified into two categories: the climbing fibers and mosey fibers. A little about the climbing fibers, that they releases excitatory neurotransmitter which is spartate, and mosey fibers, they releases the neurotransmitter which is glutamate. And of course, climbing fibers, they are called climbing because they climb over the three layers, and then they release spartate in air and stimulate the Purkinje fibers. We'll study that later on. But we must know that there is only one fiber, which is known as the inferior olivary cerebellar fiber. And mosey fibers, all the fibers except the climbing fiber, they come in the category of the mosey fiber. So they can be like inferior spinocerebellar fiber, or it can be the anterior spinocerebellar, or it can be pontocerebellar, or it can be reticulocerebellar fiber. So these are all coming in the category of the mosey fibers. These fibers, when go into the cerebellum, they releases glutamate, which is a excitatory neurotransmitter, means that they stimulate the Purkinje fibers, giving out an inhibitory response. Now, how actually this happens in climbing or in mosey fibers? Before studying the mechanism, let us study about the structure of the cerebellum. That cerebellum is comprised of two structures, which is the cerebellar cortex. Of course, it's the outer covering, and it's comprised of the gray matter, and it contains three layers, which I personally learned it from a mnemonic, and that is like my personal garden. My is for molecular layer, which is the outer layer, in Purkinje layer, which is the middle, and of course the granular layer, which is the deep layer of cerebral cortex. Below this granular layer, we have the white matter, and both forms the structure of cerebellum. Now, the nucleus, which are embedded here in white matter, like they're completely different from the nucleus of our somatic cells. Sometimes what happens is that in white matter we find a clump of mass of gray matter, and we call them as nuclei having some deep functions. We'll come across with them. Like as I have written here, that embedded in the white matter, there are three masses of gray matter, and those three masses, they form the intracerebellar nuclei. Then we have in here deep nucleus. Okay, coming here to the climbing fibers. When climbing fibers are moving across the three layers of the cerebral cortex, what happens is that they stimulate the cerebellar deep nucleus here by releasing what? Spartate is an excitatory neurotransmitter, and then moving up into the molecular layer where they release spartate, and what they do is they stimulate the Purkinje fibers coming down, and then they releases inhibitory response neurotransmitter is GABA on the cerebellar deep nucleus. So they inhibit the cerebellar deep nucleus from overshooting response. So this happens like there is a control and balance of the sensory output responses, and then they sensory output responses are also inhibited by the climbing fibers from overshooting. Like there should not be too much response, so that the body will be disturbed and imbalanced. That is the reason cerebellum is concerned with the balance and coordination of the body. Now this was about climbing fibers is pretty cool and very simple. Now coming across to the Mosey fibers is a little bit tricky but not that difficult. Mosey fiber can be any, but how it's stimulated and then how it releases GABA. There's the same case like here. When Mosey fibers are moving up, they releases glutamate because they have excitatory neurotransmitter as glutamate, and then they stimulate the deep nucleus for giving the output response. And as they reach up to the granular layer, they do not move up like climbing fibers to the molecular layer. They in granular layer stimulates the granular cells. Then these granular cells move up to the molecular layer where they actually fibricate, and they meet up with the Purkinjeal fibers. Here they stimulate the Purkinjeal fibers, and then they come down up to the deep nucleus where they releases GABA here, and they inhibit the overshooting response from the cerebellar deep nucleus to the periphery part of the body. So that was also simple. Now we got another cell here which is a little bit more trickier than this one. What happens is that as these Mosey fibers are moving up, they release this excitatory neurotransmitter here on the deep nucleus, as here. Then they move upward. What they do is actually they stimulate the granular cells here. These granular cells, as they are moving up in the Purkinjeal layer, what they do is that they give out the branches and they stimulate the Golgi cells here. You see, this is the Golgi cell they stimulate. Now, these Golgi cells in return, what they do is that they releases GABA here on the, you can say on the granular cells, and these granular cells are inhibited by Golgi cells. Okay, so this is the one case. How it does is that these Mosey fibers move up to the granular layer, and then they stimulate the granular cells, and granular cells in the Purkinjeal layers stimulate the Golgi cells. Golgi cells coming down releases GABA, neurotransmitter inhibitory, and they inhibit the overshooting response of the Golgi cells, granular cells, sorry. Now as they move upward, it's the same case. They fibricate and then they meet up with the Purkinjeal fibers, Purkinjeal fiber coming down, and then they releases neurotransmitter is GABA, and then they inhibit the deep nucleus from overshooting. Now, these Golgi cells can either be stimulated in the Purkinjeal layer by granular cells, or these can also be directly stimulated from the Mosey fiber. So either way, they'll have to release their inhibitory response. Now, there is another diagram, as you can see, quick review of it, that basket and stellate cells. What happened is that these are inhibitory interneurons, and what happens is as these Mosey fibers are moving up, they stimulate the granular cells. Granular